Devil May Cry is arguably one of the most influential and coolest series ever made in gaming, right? And I've lately, I watched the anime and I was like, holy shit, this is cool. Let me try out the games. And I tried out the first one, and it is arguably a masterpiece. Now, obviously, because it was made in the PS2 era, a lot of the, you know, er- errors or I suppose problems that plagued PS2 games will kind of be very evident here. For example, you got the camera is really janky in a lot of the fights, and that is what lost me in the fight that kind of just made me not complete the game. I got stuck on Nightmare the third time, and then my save just didn't save, so I got sent back like 3, 4 levels, and I was just like, grand, I'm not going back. So obviously, quick disclaimer there, I haven't beat Mundus and I haven't finished the game, but obviously, I know what happens, and I think it is a very good story. And you might be thinking, for someone that hasn't completed the game, and in the streams I got a bit angry, what makes you think it's a masterpiece? Well, the genre you put Devil May Cry into could be considered hack and slash. And typically those are games where they just give you a really strong weapon and throw a lot of enemies at you, and it's just slicing and dicing your way through the level, whatever, grabbing an objective to the side, you know, obviously kind of boring stuff. But the way Devil May Cry does it is very interesting because even for a PS2 era game, there was a lot of depth in the combat. I think it at the time did revolutionize that genre's game combat, and part of it being I think it was supposed to be a Silent Hill game or some horror-esque game, and that really you can see it because it is as much a horror game as it is an action game. And aside from the story, because the story, in my opinion, isn't the most interesting, Trish just disappears for ages and you fight your way through this castle, whatever. You find Virgil. That's about it. There's no depth to the story, but that's grand because it's the first game. Like, um, the combat was shown that like you have Alistair, which has its own, it has the lightning, it has its own version with the Devil Trigger that has air raid, and then you have Ifrit, which is full on hands up, you know, bang bang bang, charge up, you know, fists of fury like esque shit, right? And what I enjoyed a lot too was the fact that towards the end of the game, you're kind of you're you're kind of shown that different weapons do different damage to enemies. Like once you get, I believe his name is Plasma, but might be wrong. He kind of looks like the dude from the anime, but the dude with one eye made out of electricity, basically. Like you can't use Alistair on him. He reproduces, blah blah blah. You kind of die because oh dear, And what you want to do is you swap to Ifrit, which is a completely different element, and that is very in depth for a game that came out, on the PS2. Um, I probably won't play DMC 2. I might go from the 3 and 4, but I won't be able to do 5 because my broadcast can't afford that. But you know, a lot of what was implemented in the later games was just built off what was in the first game. You had you had taunts where you just taunt the boss you're fighting or the enemies you're fighting, and I'm sure that has effects. And later on, they add style to the DMC games, so it's more than just a hack and slash. It's a you can you can express yourself with the style you put into your combat. And the gameplay in the background that I have probably isn't the best because janky camera, and just, I'm not really a biggest fan of the hack and slash genre. But it is a very kind of cool and deep, interesting thing when a game encourages you to use different weapons for different enemies. Ghost of Tsushima had that, and that is incredibly loved for that reason. Because I've played Ghost of Tsushima, right? And while yes, it was annoying at times, I always admired the fact that they were ballsy enough to put in different stances for different enemies. Obviously, you get to the Ghost of Tsushima Legends and it doesn't really matter anymore. You know, you just kind of use the same two stances. But the fact that you have a different stance that, you know, deals with a different enemy better than other enemies is just such an interesting idea. And the fact that you do that with weapons in DMC 1, a game that came out in early 2000s or late 90s, it's very, very admirable and interesting that they went and tried that. You know, as far as I'm aware, they could have been the first people to try something like that. Obviously, correct me if I'm wrong. You know, in an era with a lot of Sonic Adventure 2, you know, a lot of new and interesting games, you know, DMC kind of made a place for itself, and it has the bones of a horror game. So, you know, there is a lot of horror in the game where, you know, you get jumped by some of the first enemies out of nowhere. And, you know, you got Dante, who is a pretty cool main character, I will not lie. You know, anyone that's played or watched or, you know, read DMC, because I know there's like a manga for that, but only in Japanese. Dante is just kind of a devil may care attitude, which is where this, you know, the name of the series comes from. It's, you know, it's a play on devil may care, devil may cry. And, you know, then a central point of the story is Dante telling Trish that you couldn't be a demon because demons can't cry, and how tears are a good thing to have, which is very interesting too. But also just the depth of, you know, you get the weapons, and Dante does his whole, you know, flipping it around, dancing and stuff. And every weapon had something interesting about it. Like, you know, the full sword of Sparta had no devil trigger, and it was like the full final form of Force Edge. And while I didn't use it personally, I'm sure, you know, there is an audience for that because it has the whole stretching into a pickaxe or a scythe or whatever. And that's pretty cool, you know. You're playing DMC and you get this whole new weapon that doesn't, you know, have devil trigger. However, you know, I would also compare the game to a Souls-like in the fact that if you don't have enough yellow orbs, when you die, you get sent all the way back to starter level. And you know, that's all fine and dandy when the levels are short or it's just a boss, because you know, you just walk back in the door and you're stuck watching the cutscene again. Not a big pain in the ass. But later on in levels, I was nearly sweating away, you know, what little sanity I had trying to pop an untouchable so I didn't die, you know, mid combo or mid boss fight and get stuck, you know, do another 20 minutes to get there, die again, blah blah blah, right? And obviously after couple of attempts, you kind of realize, and you know, you see patterns that you can avoid. But just the depth of the bosses in the combat, where each boss had something where you have to kind of risk yourself. For example, the first one with the spider, you can only damage his face. So, you know, you have to either bait him and, you know, risk getting hit by whatever attacks he has, you know, getting hit in the face, blah, blah, blah. Or, you know, you gotta risk jumping on his back where, you know, he could shoot up lava and kill you, but you can do a shit ton of damage. And having just that in-depth combat and just so much innovation in a game so early on in gaming history, you know, PS2 and Xbox 360 and Xbox area era really shaped gaming as a whole. You know, I do believe that, you know, the GameCube, you know, Mario 64, you know, Sega Dreamcast and all them, they really did wonders for the industry. But when Sony and Microsoft came in with the Xbox and PlayStation, that was kind of what, you know, revolutionized it. And I feel like DMC kind of has that effect on its whole genre. You know, it's, with everything and all the time, there's new innovations shaping, you know, the world and different things. And DMC shaped, you know, the hack and slash genre and just, you know, action genre where, you know, fighting doesn't have to be the one style. You can have different weapons that have different purposes. And that is all. You know, please do tell me your opinions about DMC as a whole. For anyone that's completed it, you know, massive respect to you. I could only get to level 20 and I just couldn't do it anymore. But massive respect to all of you. Um, Please do leave a like on the video if you liked it. And please consider subscribing because it does mean a lot and it does help the channel. And I will see you guys in the next video.